before I turned it off. There's Trey. Trey, what are you going to say to Grandma?
Mom, I want to say, McDonald's.
Okay, well, hurry up because we're getting ready to turn it off.
McDonald had a farm, A-I-A-N-O. On the farm, he had a...
Dog.
No.
Well, what?
Alligator.
Okay.
A-I-A-N-O. And the quack. I'm going to...
Go ahead.
I've always wanted to have children. For the most part, I thought I would have all girls. God had other plans, and I like to say that He knew best. I had 3 sons. Timmy was my firstborn. He was born on March 17th, 1995. And at birth, he weighed 8 pounds, 1 ounce. He was so adorable. I was literally amazed by this precious human being. And at the same time, as a single mother, I had no idea how I would take care of him. If it weren't for my village of friends, I don't know how we would have survived on my income. I mean, I was a college graduate making a little under $25,000 a year, and that was before taxes. After buying diapers and formula and then having to pay rent and a car note, I was struggling. It takes a village to raise a child. Early on, I knew I had to raise him up to believe in God. It's how I was raised, and that's how I was going to raise him. Timmy fully embraced it and accepted Jesus at a very young age. Timmy began playing football at 5 years old. He always stood out among other children because of his size. He was often the tallest and the biggest in his age group. After Timmy, Trey came along, followed by Taden. I had accomplished my dream of having children, and I had a special bond with each of them. Over the years, Timmy got more and more involved in sports, and so while all of my children played some type of sport, the focus was more on Timmy in the beginning. Then life happened. I remember waking up that morning, and my first thought was I needed to finish some Christmas shopping. So I left the house that morning, and about 45 minutes after leaving home, I received a call from Trey, and he was crying. I arrived home to find my apartment surrounded by police and first responders. It still hadn't registered in my mind something terrible had happened.
When Timmy died, I was 13 years old and I was in the 8th grade. Timmy was funny. He was a comedian. He always knew how to make you feel better no matter what mood you were in. And he always knew what to do to cheer you up.
I never entered Timmy's bedroom that morning because I thought I was doing the right thing by allowing him to sleep in. having just come off of the football season, he needed to catch up on his rest, so I thought I was being a good mom by not disturbing him.
I learned about Timmy's death actually through one of my high school friends who I hadn't talked to in a while. She happened to text me around 6 or 7 p.m. I had just come back from dinner with my grandmother actually, and she texted me and she said, "Did Timmy die?" And my immediate reaction is, "What?" And she told me to go look on Facebook. So I remember that night I just went onto his Facebook and I saw that his brother had posted a RIP message on his Facebook page, to which immediately my mom said, call him, see if it's true. And I said, no, his phone's broken, I can't call him. She's like, well, you have his house number. So I remember calling his mom and I couldn't speak. So I made my mom speak on the phone and she had confirmed that it was true.
When Timmy died, I was 9 years old. Timmy was helpful, he was ambitious, he was strong, and he was caring. Timmy was just always positive. He was honestly a comedian. He was always fun to be around.
Timmy was 16 years old when he died. He appeared to be in the best shape of his life, so his death was an absolute shock to everyone.
So the night that Timmy passed away, I remember talking to him. I remember texting him because we were teenagers and that's the main way of communication. I was on the phone with him, texting him, just talking about random things, nothing in particular.
What I noticed was how quiet the room was. And that was unusual because Timmy snores, like loud. So the fact that his room was silent was weird to me. I remember waking up, going to the bathroom to brush my teeth first, and then going to his room. I remember hopping on the PlayStation, realizing something is wrong. Trey woke up, and before he left the house, he was telling Timmy that he was about to leave. Trey started examining his body, and then he was like, feel Timmy's feet. Is his feet cold? I was like, his feet are very cold. And then he kicked me out the room.
When I first entered Timmy's room, I just screamed at him to get up because I was leaving to go to one of my basketball games. When he didn't respond, I went over and slapped the bottom of his foot because that was something we used to do to wake each other up. When I first touched his foot, I felt how cold it was. That's when I removed the covers and felt that his whole body was cold. I knew something was wrong, so I shut the door.
So Trey closed the door and he called my mom and he said, Mom, Timmy peed the bed. And I was like, why is Timmy peeing the bed? Timmy's too old to be peeing the bed. This doesn't make sense. And then Trey said, I think he died. And when I heard that, I dropped down to my knees and I said, God, please don't take Timmy away. Don't take Timmy away, please.
When I first made the call to 911, I had to explain the scenario to them. Timmy was laying face down on his bed, and the first thing they instructed me to do was to roll him on his back. So the first 3 or 4 minutes of the call is just us trying to figure out the best way to roll him on his back, because I was alone and Timmy was a lot bigger and heavier than me. After some time, we decided for me to roll Timmy onto me and I would then fall on to the floor. Once we got him on the floor, we performed a series of checks to assess his condition. And from then, I was directed to start CPR.
Because no one could tell how he died, his bedroom was processed forensically, like how they do at crime scenes. They asked to check his cell phone and his computer, To say I was living a nightmare is an understatement. The criminal investigation had blindsided me. In any event, I understood a forensic autopsy had to be done. I would have wanted one anyway.
Timmy never really mentioned to me anything about not feeling well, especially that night, no. What I remember is every now and then he would get headaches that he would complain about, whether it was stress related from school or football or whatever it may be, but nothing ever to the extreme of unbearable not feeling well. Just, I think the normal everyday headache that we all get.
What are you doing?
This is my first videotape.
First videotape of what?
Of anything.
Can I please see the camera? Yo,
Niggas, Emily, look at her. She's so adorable. She's like, anyways, I'm just playing sunshine. You know that little grandpa really loves you, little kid. Stop, yo. Yo. There goes my fan right there, yo. Okay, you know what? I'm gonna cut this off.
3 excruciating months after Timmy's death, the investigators reported no evidence of foul play. But what I would learn brought me to my knees. The body is that of a well-developed, well-nourished, unclad adolescent male. The body weighs 218 pounds, is 6 feet, 4 inches in length, and appears to be compatible with the reported age of 16 years. This 16-year-old black male died of sudden cardiac death due to accessory conduction pathway within the heart. Manner of death is natural. It was Timmy's brothers who had found him instead of me. And that has been my guilt. When Timmy made that post, he had no idea his story would be about his untimely death, and I would be the one to tell it. When I said goodnight to him, I didn't know it'd be the last good night we would have together.
That night, as far as I remember, Timmy didn't have many plans. The last thing that we talked about was, I'm gonna go to sleep, good night. He didn't really talk too much about what he had done that day. I actually think the conversation was more about me and me venting about what was going on in my life at the time.
I was on a mission to find the last person who had spoken with Timmy. I felt that this individual could add a missing piece to the puzzle about how this happened. I really had nothing to go on, so I turned to social media for answers.
The conversation with Timmy ended probably after midnight. I can actually pull it up on my phone and see. Looks like December 17th, 2011, 12:39 a.m. He told me that he was going to bed, to which I replied at 12:41 a.m. that I was saying goodnight, which had delivered and he had read it. So that was when the conversation ended.
If Timmy's nightly routine involved him exercising right before bed, how significant was that in all of this? Trey remembers getting up around 6 a.m. to turn off Timmy's alarm clock. At that time, he didn't understand why Timmy hadn't gotten up himself to turn it off. To my disbelief, I learned that Timmy was not the first athlete to die suddenly, and unfortunately, he wouldn't be the last either. What is going on with our young athletes? It never even occurred to me that this was happening to other families. I personally didn't know any family this had happened to. It was a wake-up call. The first time Timmy ever had a heart screening done was in 2009. He continued to play high school football from 2009 until 2011, when he died. Biggest misconception about sudden cardiac death is it won't happen to my child. It's a fundamentally inaccurate misconception.
Sudden cardiac arrest reflects an inability of the heart to keep up with the demands of the body, either because of obstruction to blood flow or because of heart rhythm problems that prevent effective cardiac output. Cessation of cardiac activity means electrical silence of the heart, or the heart rhythm is much too slow to sustain cardiac output or much too chaotic and ineffective in maintaining cardiac output. The rhythm abnormality may come about from certain abnormalities of the underlying electrical or muscular system of the heart. Heart rates that are much too slow or chaotic and much too fast cannot sustain bodily functions and are associated with collapse of the patient. The term that's used in that situation is sudden cardiac arrest.
The youth sports industry is a billion-dollar business. Heart screenings are critical in predicting and identifying cardiac disease, but they're not recommended annually as a requirement for sports participation. Why is that?
We see a lot of kids, I'm a pediatric cardiologist, who have episodes of fainting where they have a loss of consciousness. And initially to families, it very often appears that there's a collapse of the patient and everybody worries about cardiac activity being adequate at that point. But most of us who faint despite having continued cardiac activity. We faint very often because our blood pressure may be transiently too low or heart rate transiently too slow. We call that vasodepressor syncope, but there is continued cardiac function. It's just not adequate to maintain blood flow to the brain. The brain gets very unhappy in that situation. The body will collapse so that the brain and the heart are at the same level. Blood flow can be restored and the patient recovers spontaneously very often. So sudden cardiac arrest is a much more serious problem, but to the family initially, both things may look very similar. The causes of sudden cardiac arrest in children and in teenagers and young adults has been well studied and well defined by various professional agencies. I like to think of it in the following way. First of all, there's sudden cardiac arrest that occurs in people previously known, children and teenagers and adults for that matter, previously known to have normal hearts with no symptoms, who are affected by an intercurrent viral illness. And the viral illness may cause inflammation of the heart muscle, which produces a combination of poor cardiac muscle function. Poor cardiac output is the medical term, and may produce significant and life-threatening heart rhythm problems. Ventricular tachycardia and ventricular fibrillation being the concerning heart rhythms. So this occurs in patients with previously normal heart findings. Kids who have been perfectly fine their whole lives get sick and may collapse suddenly, very often can collapse during excessive exertion as the first manifestation of their acquired heart problem. Acquired heart problems can also be inflammation of the coronary arteries, which may occur in diseases such as Kawasaki's disease, with inadequate flow to the heart muscle because of blockage of blood vessels, the coronary arteries, causing ischemia, inadequate flow, which produces heart rhythm problems, which is the common substrate very often in cardiac collapse. Fortunately, these inflammatory issues are relatively uncommon. We do see kids every year who have these issues, but they're not a very common finding.
I remember one conversation I had with Timmy. He shared with me that on several occasions while at football practice, he experienced shortness of breath. Well, I never knew that was one of the warning signs.
I have felt short of breath before. When you're doing training and conditioning, you're going to get short of breath. It happens to most athletes.
I have experienced shortness of breath. It usually happens when I'm running long distance runs. I can feel my heart racing through my body, through my head, my feet, my legs, and my hands. It sort of immobilizes you.
The next category of cardiac problems which can cause cardiac collapse are patients with congenital heart disease, birth defects of the heart, the most common example of which is aortic valve stenosis, obstruction to blood flow between the left ventricle and the aorta. And with increased cardiac output, the obstruction becomes worse. The pressure builds up in the left ventricle. There develops increased wall stress in the left ventricle, which can produce a combination of low cardiac output and ischemia, causing heart rhythm problems and cardiac collapse. Fortunately, in the current era, diagnosis of aortic valve stenosis is pretty easy, based on clinical suspicion, clinical examination, and confirmed by echo. So this is relatively uncommon these days because kids are often sent for evaluation, and the problem detected. When it's severe, the problem can be improved with medical care and surgical intervention or catheter intervention to relieve the obstruction. From a congenital heart standpoint, the one concerning finding, concerning abnormality rather, is the presence of coronary artery anomalies, particularly left coronary artery arising from the right side of the aorta, the right sinus of Valsalva. This is a clinically silent problem. There's no way of detecting it by clinical examination. The most common presentation, unfortunately, is sudden cardiac collapse, usually during sports participation. Sometimes the diagnosis is made on echo, done for other reasons, and you stumble across the diagnosis in an asymptomatic patient. That's a very happy circumstance because then you can intervene surgically and minimize or eliminate the risk of sudden cardiac collapse and sudden cardiac death. So that's the aortic stenosis is the noisy congenital heart problem that can create a risk to the patient. On the other end of the spectrum is the silent one, anomalous origin of the left coronary artery, which is very difficult to detect before sudden cardiac collapse occurs or detected on autopsy, which is, of course, a tragic situation, but still occurs and is very difficult to prevent. The next category of patients have what's called genetic abnormalities of heart muscle. Genetic abnormalities of heart muscle, in the way I think about them, occur in two varieties. The first and the most concerning is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a thickening of the heart muscle, often running in families and can be addressed by my colleague in cardiac genetics. But this is a problem where the heart muscle becomes thick, obstructs the flow of blood out of the left ventricle. That obstruction becomes significantly worse with exercise and may prevent effective cardiac output, cause rhythm abnormalities, and produce sudden cardiac collapse. This is the diagnosis that can be screened for most effectively by primary care doctors asking a complete family history, doing an examination which raises concern about an outflow obstructive murmur, and suspicion confirmed by obtaining an electrocardiogram, which is almost always abnormal in patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Unfortunately, nothing is 100% in medicine, but EKG is a very good screening technique. Any child or teen with a family history of sudden cardiac death, of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, with an abnormal EKG, every child should be seen by a pediatric cardiologist to have a screening echo and to see if there is reason for medical intervention and surgical intervention, and most importantly, restriction from competitive sports. So this is a very large category of patients. In situations where there has been effective screening, okay, such as the regions in northern Italy, where the program was started in the 1990s to look and try to reduce the risk of sudden cardiac death due to hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Screening techniques have been very effective in eliminating sudden death from this problem.
I had a friend who felt like something was wrong with his heart. And I was like, doesn't your brother have heart problems? And he said, yes. I said, did you ever get your heart checked out? And he said, no. I was like, I think you should do that. Until this day, I still don't know if he got his heart checked out.
Another form of genetic abnormalities of heart muscle include dilated cardiomyopathies. Again, very often in a careful history noted to run in families. The cardiac enlargement will produce ischemia or heart muscle blood flow lack of supply during exercise, which may precipitate heart rhythm abnormalities and produce sudden cardiac collapse. Another category of genetic abnormalities are the aortopathies, genetic abnormalities which run in families with diseases such as Marfan syndrome or Loeys-Dietz syndrome. Both of the genetic abnormalities for these two diseases were discovered at Hopkins by colleagues in cardiac genetics, Dr. Dietz during his fellowship and during his faculty tenure at Hopkins. And because there is known risk of cardiac collapse, patients need to be screened very carefully and serially on a yearly basis if there is any aortic dilatation found. The risk there being somewhat different. The risk there being the risk of aortic dilatation, aortic rupture, and sudden cardiac death. The most famous athlete to die from this during the 90s, when this was getting a lot of attention, was Flo Hyman, an international star in women's volleyball, who collapsed during a practice session on the U.S. Olympic team. So the screening of very tall, thin people, you don't have to be tall and thin to have Marfan syndrome, but it's one of the characteristic features of the skeletal abnormality. But the screening of patients suspected of having Marfan syndrome for aortic dilatation is very often life-saving because those patients can be restricted from high-intensity sports, from contact sports. The aortic size can be tracked, and if the aortic size gets to be greater than 4.5 or 5 centimeters in a full-size adult, then aortic surgery to replace the enlarged aorta can be taken and very often is life-saving. So those are the big categories of structural abnormalities. The last very large category of risk factors relates to rhythm abnormalities of the heart, rhythm abnormalities which are based on molecular genetic abnormalities in the patient, the most common of which is long QT syndrome. Long QT syndrome was first recognized in patients dying suddenly by doing EKGs on relatives, so investigations in certain communities of patients where sudden cardiac death was found to be prevalent, and also by research in animal models, the most famous of which was in Dalmatians. Work done in the 1960s found that Dalmatians were dying suddenly. When EKGs were being done on Dalmatians, they were found to have long QT on their EKGs, and Dalmatians and human counterparts also were found to have congenital deafness. So that combination brought a lot of attention to the genetics of rhythm abnormalities back in the 1950s and 1960s. And with the advent of molecular diagnosis, the information has exploded. So long QT syndrome is now looked for in any patient who dies suddenly with molecular testing, so the so-called post-mortem autopsy, and other clinical diagnosis such as Brugada syndrome have gotten a lot of attention in terms of the risk that that creates for sudden cardiac death as well. Again, the substrate being the development of ventricular tachycardia and ventricular fibrillation, causing cardiac collapse and sudden cardiac death.
Did Timmy have long QT syndrome or something else?
My name is Dr. Rotimi Meshubi. I work here at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, and I'm an electrophysiologist, which is a fancy way of saying a heart doctor that specializes in taking care of electrical problems of the heart. Of particular interest to me, somebody has died suddenly in a family, and as you can appreciate, this is a very traumatic event for most families, and typically most people are trying to find out, one, why did this happen? And secondly, is there any way to prevent this from happening again? We do know several genes and mutations, which are changes in genes that can cause problems that have been reported and known to cause sudden death. So typically our approach to this is first to find out from the family if there are any other members of the family that have ever had any problems, either somebody that died suddenly without any good explanation, somebody that drowned suddenly without any good explanation, somebody that died in a car accident driving without any good explanation. Sometimes these are red flags that somebody may have died suddenly from an electrical problem that happened in the heart. So we ask about family members on both sides of the family, and we go through several generations to see if we can identify any patterns of people that are dying suddenly to help us narrow down where this may be coming from. And once we do that, then the next question becomes, who do we test in the family? And typically, if we're lucky, we'd hope that when this sudden death occurred, the medical examiner or the hospital where the person passed away would have saved some samples from the person that died suddenly. And so we can always go back to the medical examiner's office or to the hospital with the family's permission to go test and see if we could identify any of these changes in the genes that may have been responsible for the sudden death in the family. Specific tests we do to address the issue of whether this was a genetic problem that was inherited or passed through the family is a genetic test. And for us to go through the genetic test, we sort of have, it entails two things. One is, as you can imagine, finding out information about your genetics and whether you have genetic mutations or abnormalities can have a big influence in your life going forward. So before we even proceed with doing this test, we have a session where we have our genetic counselors, and these are well-trained specialists that are experts in performing genetic counseling as well as interpreting genetic results.
My name is Rebecca McClellan, and I'm a genetic counselor with the Center for Inherited Heart Diseases at Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins Center for Inherited Heart Diseases provides a lot of services. It's primarily focused on family-centered care, providing both cardiology care, but also genetic counseling. Our goal is really to identify genetic heart conditions and slow their progression through preventative care and also advanced treatment for patients and their families. The conditions we see in the Johns Hopkins Center for Inherited Heart Diseases vary. We see a lot of patients who have something called cardiomyopathy, which is a structural change to the heart muscle that can make the heart too big and too weak in a variety of different ways. These can often be genetic. We see a lot of patients who have inherited arrhythmia conditions. So these are primary electrical problems with the heart. And we also will see patients who have genetic lipid disorders. We also see a lot of families like Teleah and her family who have come to us because of a history of a sudden cardiac arrest or a sudden cardiac death in their family, where there is a suspicion that there is one of these underlying inherited heart conditions as part of the reason they're coming to see us. Genetic testing is the process of looking through the instructions that are in all of our cells, basically our DNA, for changes that would make that gene not be able to do its job. So basically, every cell of our bodies has a blueprint or an instruction guide that tells that cell how to work or how to do its job. And we can have differences in those DNA letters that make up those genes that can sometimes lead to the gene not doing its job correctly. A genetic counselor can have many different roles. The one I've been saying for a long time, probably since I began in this career field almost 20 years ago, is that it's my job to make sure the family and the patient understands everything the doctor just said. Genetic counselors are, I think, especially equipped at breaking down complicated medical information and making it very accessible for a patient and a family. So helping them to understand that information. But that's not really the primary role of genetic counselors. It's sort of an added bonus of getting to work with one of us. Most genetic counselors, our roles are primarily to help families and patients work through the genetic testing process. So our job is to help families explore the different options, how they might work for their family, and then also to help talk through the benefits of how that testing might help their family, the ways that it may be limited and not be able to help their family, and also sometimes the different risks that can be associated with genetic testing, like, for example, something called genetic discrimination. So making sure a family has a full and comprehensive understanding of what and how genetic testing would work for their family.
The sudden death of a child is very cruel. You get no time to plan. I want you to imagine waking up one morning and discovering your child had died during the early hours of the morning. Can you imagine that?
So when I first met with Teleah and her sons Trayvon and Tatum, it was back in 2015. And it was unfortunately several years after they had lost their brother and son, Timothy. As part of my first interaction with the families, one of the things that we explored at the beginning was whether or not there was actually any sample remaining from Timothy that could be gathered and then preserved for the family to kind of help, not just at that point in time, but for the future in trying to understand this inherited heart condition or the cause of his cardiac arrest. We unfortunately, we reached out to the medical examiner at that time, and unfortunately no sample was available or had been saved at that point to help us with the process. It's often very important to start genetic testing in the individual within the family who has the clearest diagnosis. Timothy, as a young, previously healthy gentleman with only a little bit of hypertension, having a sudden cardiac death at such a young age clearly made it a very high suspicion that there was some type of inherited heart condition going on for him. And so trying to retrieve and preserve that sample for the family's benefit was a priority for us at the beginning. It's important for people to know that. It's not always thought about when someone passes so suddenly. There's so much going on and so much grief. And unfortunately, it's not well understood by all of the different medical examiners and offices throughout this country still, that these are conditions that should be thought about right away. So I think that that's an important message for people to hear, is that if there is an unexplained sudden cardiac death, that's sort of preserving some sample in some way, even if you're not going to act on it at that point in time, making sure that something is saved for the benefit of family is really important. Because we didn't have any sample from Timothy to use for testing, we turned to the family and what information do we have from the family that might help guide our next steps. We started by having Teleah and Trayvon and Tayden all go through comprehensive cardiac evaluations, looking not only for signs of cardiac dysfunction that might suggest they need care and management for themselves, because that's honestly is our first and foremost goal with all of this, is how do we make sure we're keeping everybody in the family safe. So we started there looking for signs, and also those evaluations can sometimes give us clues. And that's what we're doing in cardiac genetics, is we're looking for clues to try to find the answer for what's going on for this family. So through those evaluations, we had a couple breadcrumbs that fell out, and that's what I would call them, breadcrumbs. They weren't clear-cut diagnoses. They were little pieces of information that might suggest something going on here, but also could be, variations of normal, which is unfortunately sometimes what we're left with. Leah ended up having a little bit of what's called QT prolongation, which is a sign that the heart just takes a little bit longer to reset to the next beat. Again, nothing that by itself probably would have been paid a whole lot of attention to, but that in the context of Timothy's death was one little breadcrumb. The boys also, Trayvon and Tayden, also had what we would call borderline QT prolongation and some little bit of abnormalities in the way something called T waves are formed on their ECGs. These are things that are little signs that we can see when you look at the rhythm of someone's heart by placing some monitors kind of on their heart and measuring the rhythm of the heart. So with these couple kind of breadcrumbs in front of us, the decision from our team was to recommend genetic testing for Teleah, because her diagnosis at that point, that QT prolongation, was a bigger breadcrumb than the little bits that we were seeing from her sons. We recommended that Teleah have what's called a comprehensive arrhythmia panel. This was a panel of 30 genes that basically were genes that have been associated with different inherited heart conditions. So it included genes that can cause things like long QT syndrome, which is the name of the condition when you actually have that QT prolongation in a consistent and severe way. But it also, we didn't put all of our eggs in one basket. So we also included genes that can cause other types of inherited arrhythmia conditions, and also some genes that can cause structural changes to the heart that can make the heart get too large or too weak, that can then secondarily cause arrhythmia problems. So it was based on Teleah's findings, but also a few findings, little breadcrumbs that had come out of Timothy's autopsy report as well. That testing for Teleah came back, and it showed us what's called a variant of uncertain significance in a gene called KCNH2. So a variant of uncertain significance means it is a difference in the DNA. It's a misspelling in the DNA code that makes up that particular gene. But it's one where we don't have enough evidence right now, or at that point in time, because we're talking 2015, we didn't have enough evidence at that point in time to know, is this possibly significant? Is this actually impacting the function or the job that gene needs to do in our body? Or could this be a benign change simply because we went looking through Teleah's DNA? KCNH2 is a gene that is involved with helping to move potassium in and out of the heart cells. And so it is a gene that we associate typically with a condition called long QT syndrome that I mentioned before. But her particular change is one that had not really been seen that much before. It had been seen in just one patient in a published paper, in one patient who didn't have long QT syndrome either. This patient had Brugada syndrome, which is a totally different inherited heart condition that affects the channels and the rhythm of the heart. But it had been reported before. And then beyond that, we could see that it had also been showing up in a low, it was present, but at a very low frequency in individuals who are of African ancestry. So we all have changes in our DNA, and many times those changes are there just because of who we are and where we've come from. And the hardest part sometimes of genetic testing is figuring out, is that change just a benign change because of who we are and where we've come from, or is that change something that is significant and could impact the job the gene needs to do? So from there, what we decided to do was, this was an uncertain change. And when you find an uncertain change, you're often trying to say, well, how can we be more certain of what it means or not? So we were thinking, is there anything we can do to try to say, do we think that this is more likely to be part of what's going on for this family or less likely to be part of what's going on for this family? And given that both Tayden and Trayvon had some breadcrumbs related to long QT syndrome too, so they had just borderline levels of their QT, we decided that it would be appropriate to do targeted testing to see if one, both, or neither of the boys also carried that change in KCNH2. And the idea was that if these long QT or QT breadcrumbs were actually part of the story for this family, and that all of the individuals in the family had some evidence of it, even if it was minor. If they all had the change, then our suspicion that this was part of what was going on was going to be higher. But that if they didn't all have the change, then we would be more likely to say this is maybe not part of what's going on. And when we got the boys' results back, we ended up learning that Trayvon did have the same change as Teleah in this KCNH2 gene, but Tayden did not. So that, again, it's not 100% that it ruled out that this was playing a role, but it did make it a little less likely, in our opinion, given that not all three members of the family had it, and all three were showing some evidence of QT prolongation. So at that point, the recommendation was that, we don't know for sure what the role this variant is playing, if any. We're going to just have to watch and wait. And this is unfortunately is part of genetic testing sometimes. We still, in cardiac genetics and in any area of genetics, we have no single test that can look and find the cause for a genetic condition in every person. So cardiac genetic testing is fairly good for diagnoses like long QT and things like that. We have upwards of a 70% detection rate. But when you don't have a clear diagnosis, meaning we don't know exactly why Timothy passed away, right? We're trying to pull breadcrumbs together. And you come in with we suspect that this is inherited, related to the heart. The yield of genetic testing is still pretty low. It can be 20 up to maybe 40%, depending on the reports and the studies that you look at. So unfortunately, genetic testing doesn't always give us the answer. We know over time that we're going to continue to learn, and more genes that can cause these conditions, that testing will get better, that our knowledge around this area is going to improve. And that's what we shared with Teleah and her sons, was for now, we've checked your hearts out. We are making sure we're addressing anything medically there that needs to be done to keep you guys safe and to keep you healthy, and that we're just going to need to let the genetic testing get a little bit better.
While we were waiting for science to catch up, we faced another health crisis. This time, my adrenaline kicked in, and I went into overdrive, to say the least.
What are you doing? Why was you in my clothes?
Mother, are you recording me?
There are more expanded genetic tests that we sometimes can do, which then we may then go back and do. This we don't do routinely, but in certain families where we feel strongly that there's some abnormality going on that is being passed from, through the generations in the family, but our initial genetic test doesn't show us that. We have other more expanded or other types of genetic testing that is more sophisticated that we can perform. The reason we don't do this routinely is that these are pretty more extensive tests, and as you can imagine, then we also get a lot more results that come back that we cannot make sense of. So we're pretty careful about doing those types of testing, because otherwise it just causes more confusion.
So the question is how heart conditions can be detected. And I think that the important issue is the first line of defense is the primary care physician, because you don't get to see a cardiologist unless you're referred. So the primary care physician has to take a good family history, and that has to be shared openly and completely by the family, so that these genetic abnormalities can be properly investigated. So that applies whether the genetic abnormality is rhythm abnormality with prior history of sudden cardiac death, or whether there's a family history of recurrent syncope, recurrent passing out, and somebody is known to have some kind of heart problem that's not been fully defined, or genetic abnormalities such as Marfan syndrome, a high degree of suspicion in tall, thin kids, kids who are hypermobile, have very loose joints. Those kinds of family history events are really important to promote referral to a pediatric cardiologist. Any family history of unusual seizures, seizures can be misinterpreted as being a primary electrical event of the brain rather than a cardiac event. So the syncope seizures, kids passing out and then having a seizure where something doesn't fit right to the family or to the pediatrician or family practitioner, those kids should be investigated to make sure that there is no underlying cardiac risk. Certainly when there's a family history of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, Marfan syndrome, known rhythm abnormalities which are thought to be genetic, those kids automatically should be investigated starting at a very early age. Then there's the history of the patient. If the patient's presenting with chest pain with activity or syncope, passing out with activity, that can be a sign of inadequate cardiac output when the body demands more cardiac output, and can be a sign of heart muscle problems, can be a sign of inadequate ability of the heart to fill and eject blood, or signs of rhythm abnormality precipitated by activity causing inadequate cardiac output and cardiac collapse. So the fainting episode with activity is mandatory cardiac evaluation. There are a host of concerns that need to be investigated thoroughly. Physical examination is also very important. So the primary care doctor being suspicious that there's a pathologic murmur, a murmur, a noise suggesting obstruction to blood flow exiting the heart, certainly should be investigated as a sign of either hypertrophic disease or aortic stenosis. And fortunately, we do see kids much more commonly at a mild stage of disease because referrals to pediatric cardiologists are relatively easy in our neighborhood and in the United States in general. And echo is so prevalent in the care of these patients that we can very often make a diagnosis before calamity occurs. And then any other physical finding which raises concern, such as inability to feel femoral pulses, suggesting obstruction to blood flow around the aortic arch, which may cause pressure buildup in the left side of the heart, and inadequate cardiac output and fainting episodes. Those kinds of things should be fully investigated.
I have a lot of friends that may see their primary care physician regularly, but they've never seen a cardiologist and they've never had an EKG done.
The family history, the personal history, and the physical examination all lead to referral and ultimately to relatively straightforward diagnostic testing, exam, EKG, echo. If necessary, further testing, further cardiac imaging, looking for evidence of heart muscle damage. Exercise testing can be done to look for the patient's blood pressure and heart rate and heart rhythm, not only at rest, but during stress, to try to simulate any potential risk or increase in obstruction of blood flow out of the heart. Electronic monitoring of the heart, ambulatory EKG monitoring, so-called Holter monitoring for 24 hours, or event monitoring for 30 days, or long-term electrical monitoring with use of an implantable device to check heart rhythm on a regular basis, or even something as simple as using your new fancy Apple Watch, which is very capable of detecting potentially life-threatening rhythm abnormalities. And then those recordings can be sent to us for further examination. So we have lots of kids using their cell phones now, because it seems everybody's got cell phones. The cell phone is a very powerful diagnostic tool when used properly to detect rhythm abnormalities, which don't cause sudden collapse, because obviously the patient can't activate the cell phone at that time. But we can get very important information from kids, from teens and young adults when the events are occurring, and they're able to record them on their apps on their cell phones. So there are lots of tools at our disposal to diagnose and then to treat the problem depending on what it is.
Teleah came back, and her sons came back to see us again in clinic, and had updated cardiac evaluations, which again is honestly is one of the most important things here as far as making sure we're keeping her and her boys safe, is knowing what's going on with their heart on an ongoing basis. But also in taking another look at the family's records, we went through everything again. We looked at what we know now about that KCNH2 change, and also what we know and have available to us from a cardiac genetic testing standpoint. And it was decided to go ahead and first that the KCNH2 variant, since that first time we saw it in 2015, it had continued to pop up and be present, especially among presumably healthy individuals of African ancestry. This had been hinted at in 2015 when we first found the variant, but in the interim years, it had just continued to have a more and more kind of prevalence showing up. Again, we still can't rule it out completely, but it made us even less suspicious, given that they don't all have it, and given that it's continually showing up more and more in these what are called population databases, it made us even less suspicious of it. And in looking kind of collectively over the family again, one of the other new pieces of information was that Teleah now had some evidence of what's called cardiomyopathy, or at least a little bit of thickening of her heart. That thickening of the heart can happen for a number of reasons. Some of them are genetic, and sometimes it has to do with blood pressure and some other things. And so we can't be sure that thickening of the heart is related to what happened to Timothy, but it was another breadcrumb that we had in front of us at this point. And so now that breadcrumb, along with the QT prolongation and along with sort of the breadcrumbs that we were able to glean from Timothy's autopsy reports and his history, our team felt that it was worthwhile throwing a broader net from a genetic testing standpoint. So that original panel had been very focused on the genes that were most likely to cause arrhythmia, which is the approach that we typically took in 2015 when someone had had a cardiac arrest or a cardiac death in their family, and there wasn't a whole lot of other information. Now the panels have gotten bigger, the testing has gotten more approachable, more affordable, better covered by insurance for many, many different reasons that we throw these larger panels, and we again are focusing on genes that can cause both structural changes to the heart, so these different types of cardiomyopathy, same thing that we looked at the first time, and then also these inherited arrhythmia conditions. But there are many more of them, and and we aren't just focusing on the ones that have sort of the strongest chance to cause arrhythmia or cardiac arrest at this point. So we recommended this larger panel, again, starting in Teleah. She's still, based on sort of these new evaluations, is the most symptomatic available person in her family to be tested. And we recommended this broader panel that's called a combined cardiomyopathy and arrhythmia panel. And this panel has 138 genes. Admittedly, overlap between the first panel that was done. So those 30 genes that were tested the first time are going to be on this panel again. But it's going to have about 100 more genes beyond that we're going to look at this time.
I know that many people don't like to be stuck or pricked to get blood samples, so it might come as some consolation or good news that we have a kit where we swab the inside of the cheek to get some cells, and this is what is sent off for genetic testing. On average, the results from the genetic test take about 4 to 6 weeks to come back.
So that testing is still pending, and I think we are very hopeful that there will be a clear genetic marker in those results. If we're able to identify a genetic marker in Teleah that we think could be causative or put someone at risk for a cardiac arrest or one of these inherited cardiac conditions, then we can use that to see if her boys or even other family members are also at risk for these conditions. That's how we use genetic testing as a way to sort of, for what we call family screening, so to determine who else is at risk and needs to have that continued cardiac monitoring.
I don't have any concerns about my heart because I believe when it's our time to go, it's our time to go.
I do not have any concerns about my heart. For the first couple of years after Timmy passed, I was really concerned. And it led me to do more research about my health and my heart. And I began to look at the things that go into my body and take my health more serious.
No. Yes.
Not uncommon that I'm meeting with families who've had a cardiac death in their family. The response to these and the reactions and how you handle it and process it, it's not uniform, and that's so important for people to know.
I'm more concerned about the amount of weight I put on. I feel like if I don't control my weight, then it could affect my heart.
Treatments are available depending on the nature of the problem. So, for example, if we take the extreme situation of a baby born with very, very low heart rate due to a condition called congenital heart block, where the heart rate is not thought to be adequate to sustain cardiac output and sustain life, we can put a pacemaker in a newborn infant. Thank goodness technology has advanced so enormously over the past 50 years that pacemakers are very small, very powerful tools, and can be used in the smallest of our patients to sustain heart rhythm. And likewise, if we have a child who's been found to have a life-threatening rhythm abnormality, ventricular tachycardia, due to a genetic concern such as Brugada syndrome, those children can have implanted a cardiac defibrillator to prevent sudden cardiac death from ventricular tachycardia. In other words, to detect and provide an electrical shock to prevent sudden cardiac collapse. Obviously, before that, there's a host of medications that can be used to treat heart rhythm problems, from beta blockers to calcium channel blockers, all of which are used routinely in children and adolescents when the appropriate diagnosis is made. A surgical intervention to relieve severe obstruction is routinely performed in children and adolescents with aortic valve disease, surgical or catheter intervention. Surgical intervention is used in patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with severe obstruction to remove excessive muscle. So it's basically plastic surgery inside the heart to help reduce cardiac risk. So there's a wide range of medical, interventional procedures, electrical management procedures to help minimize the risk of sudden cardiac death.
The best thing I can do is to keep sharing Timmy's story. I won't rest until families know about this and more athletes live instead of dying young.
I do think my mom has become overprotective. At first it was kind of hard to deal with, but then I had to realize she lost one of her sons in her own house, where we're supposed to feel the most protected. So once I started to realize that, I began to learn to work around it and accept it.
Yes, 1000% yes. She's definitely overprotective of us now. But I also feel like she was always protective of us because we are her children. And when we lost Timmy, that kind of made it worse because she doesn't want to lose another child, and I understand that.
One of the biggest things we try not to do is give false reassurance in cardiogenetics. So we don't ever want someone to say, well, I don't have that particular change and it means I'm not at risk, and so they don't continue to see their cardiologist. That's one of the challenging parts with uncertain genetic test results, is that they can sometimes be misunderstood, right? So we don't ever release someone from cardiac screening or care until we know we are 100% we have the answer. That is no question about it. Because the last thing we want is for anybody else in the family to have an unfortunate arrest or a cardiac event the way that Timothy did. Again, as I said at the beginning, our goal really is to try to help make sure we are keeping Teleah and the rest of her family safe and cared for, and preventing any kind of sudden or unexpected cardiac tragedies to happen.
I'm glad that I'm the one that found Timmy, largely because of how scary the situation was, seeing him in that condition. A lot transpired and transitioned in me during that moment that led to me stepping up to be the big brother in terms of Tatum.
Go ahead. Kids, I love you. Kids, I need you. Kids, I love you. Oh, my. Kids, I love you. Kids, I need you. Kids, I love you. Oh, my.
Stand up.
Kids, I love you. Kids, I need you. Kids, I love you. Oh, my. Kids, I love you. Kids, I need you. Kids, I love you. Oh, my.
Lord, don't leave me, 'cause I don't know.
I'll sing.
Go ahead.
Lord, don't leave me, 'cause I don't know what I would do without you. It's in this world.
Someone once said to me, I don't know how you do it. Well, my reply to them was, I wasn't given a choice.